Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am, as Phil said, David Oldroyd-Bolt, the Anglosphere Fellow at the Danube Institute. And I would just like to say, when we finish this session, Andrew will be very kindly signing copies of his book over here, so please do come and take the opportunity of buying several. Christmas is, after all, not that far away. I don't suppose I need to introduce Andrew Doyle to a new Culture Forum audience. He is, I suppose, the most perspicacious critic and ekphrastic, tolerant, wonderful, and brilliant academic of wokeism. Now, that might sound like a contradiction in terms, wokeism, after all, not being entirely connected in the public mind with rigorous thought, but that's why it needs someone to analyze it. Andrew began this journey of analysis with his first book, The New Puritans, and continues it now with The End of Woke, which is not, sadly, to tell you all that it has ended or is about to end, but to analyze how and why it will come to an end, and what some of the pitfalls of that may be for cultural conservatives and others who oppose this completely corrosive ideology. So, Andrew, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, I see you've chosen a terrible photo of me, but that was taken when I was so hungover. They could have at least airbrushed it. It's awful, isn't
that just mandatory for all the photos?
Well, I suppose it is, yes. Not good.
You began with The New Puritans, where you outlined where you thought this movement had come from.
Yes.
And how it had developed up to, was that 3-4 years ago? Would you tell us now what the continuation of that analysis is in The End of Woke?
So the idea was that I'd written The New Puritans in a way to try and grapple with where this ideology came from, how it accrued so much power so quickly, and to sort of break it down, not just in terms of its origins, but in terms of its depredations, the various assaults it's undertaken on our society and our general sense of cohesion. So then, when we get to last year, I was thinking about adding a new introduction to that book, because a lot of things had developed. But then I realized so much has developed, so much has changed in what we call the culture war, that it had to be a whole new book. So that's what happened. The title of the book is The End of Woke, which I like to think has a kind of implied question mark at the end of it. I'm not claiming any gift of prophecy. I'm not saying that it's all over or whatever it might be. What I'm talking about is that if you think of the culture war as we understand it, I think the woke era, as we've known it, is coming to an end in its current form, and something new will happen, whether that is the ideologues of wokeness will find a way to resurrect in a new garb, whether you will have the more extreme identitarian aspect of the right filling that vacuum. There's all sorts of ways that this can happen. But one of the cases that I make is, because I've done a few interviews about this book now, and a lot of people challenge me on this idea, saying, well, it's definitely not going anywhere. I don't know if you saw just yesterday, Lady Hale, the first female president of the Supreme Court, actually had an interview and said that she said, I was talking to some doctors and they told me that biological sex doesn't exist. And that's someone who used to run the Supreme Court speaking to medical doctors. So that's a good example of how wokeness has always been a top-down ideology. It's always been something imposed and perpetuated by elites who should know better. What kind of doctor is that? I don't want to go to that doctor if they don't know the difference.
She didn't have the courtesy to name them, did she?
No, she should have done, because they'll probably try and give me a smear test or something. But the thing is, so I would say, when we're looking though, I'm not making any claims that the woke have given up. I'm not making that claim at all. In fact, we've seen with the Supreme Court ruling that biological sex means sex in terms of the Equality Act, that it doesn't mean that you change your sex by waving a certificate around. There's been a lot of pushback, and there's been a lot of charities and corporations and individuals and lawyers even saying that you should still carry on and break the law. And lots of institutions stating that they're going to break the law.
Including the Houses of Parliament, who said they're waiting for the
waiting for the guidance. Quite. So what that means, of course, is when all the slew of court cases happens, we'll have all the receipts. We'll have people posting on Twitter about their intention to break the law. So I don't think they'll have a leg to stand on. But I suppose my point wasn't that these people have gone away, or that they're even that they're quietening down, but rather that there's been too many sort of seismic shifts within this discourse that it won't be able to, the genie won't go back into the bottle. And what I mean by that is we've had the Cass review, and subsequent to that, the banning of puberty blockers by Wes Streeting, a man who used to support gender identity ideology, but then actually read about it and understood it, and then realised that it was absolutely mental. So it just takes a while. You just have to listen to what people are saying, and then it sorts itself out. So we've had the Cass review, we've had the NHS, we've had the Supreme Court ruling. Donald Trump in office in America with his slew of executive orders re-establishing that there are two sexes, no human being changes sex, that men should not be in women's prisons, men should not be in women's sports, pretty basic stuff really, that a child could have told you. All of that's happened. Then you've got the rolling back of DEI, and you've got major corporations such as Walmart and McDonald's and Google and Amazon and Meta or Facebook stripping away their DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion policies. And that's happening very, very rapidly, and that's trickling down as well. People like Robin DiAngelo, the crazy author of White Fragility, is now completely discredited. I mean, she used to get, $12,000 for an hour to go into a corporation and berate people and say, try to be less white. That's what she said at the Coca-Cola, when someone snapped her at Coca-Cola.
Being paid to be racist, not a bad job.
Being paid to be racist, yeah. What I love about Robin DiAngelo, she's a whiteness expert. Yeah. She's a white woman, and the thesis of her book, White Fragility, is that all white people are racist, and if you deny that you're racist, that's proof that you're racist, which is known as a Kafka trap. That's what they used to do with witches. And this is a white woman. And when you read the book, well, no, I wouldn't advise it, by the way, but when you read the book, what becomes absolutely clear is that she is racist. And she keeps saying, well, I'm very racist, and that must mean that all white people are racist. And it's kind of an innate condition. It's a great excuse, isn't it? So really, the whole book is an exercise in projection. Anyway, I'm going off tangent. But my point was simply that there's all these things happening. People like her are discredited. Black Lives Matter is discredited. Too many of the major figures in the Black Lives Matter movement were found to have defrauded the people who donated millions and millions of dollars, and they've all bought luxury homes in Palm Beach or whatever the hell it is. And so they've been discredited. There's all sorts of issues. But most of all, I think it's the little things that tell us that whatever woke was is not happening again. It's things like when the Jaguar advert came out, and that was, when was that, November maybe? Towards the end of last year. And there's no cars in that ad. It's just a bunch of mincing models, sort of gender fluid models, smashing things up with hammers for some reason, against a gaudy backdrop with really sort of syntactically inelegant slogans like live ordinary or delete ordinary and live vivid or what the hell, who knows? Anyway, no cars. And their sales plummeted. But, had that advert came out in 2021, it would have felt normal. That's what everyone's doing. They think that's radical. I mean, it isn't, but they think it is. That's what everyone's doing. But now it comes out and it looks dated. It looks really dated. People watch that and they sort of shrug their shoulders and thought, oh, is that it then? So, and you have people like Emily Maitlis on that interview with Rupert Lowe calling him a racist, shaking with rage. I mean, she was actually it's the kind of performance that if she looks at that objectively, I don't think she could be pleased with it. She let her emotions overcome her too much, called him a racist. But that epithet doesn't work anymore, So I think those little signs, to me, tell us that woke is dying. It's on its last legs. But, and the key question which we should discuss is what happens next. And that's what the book's about.
If I may interpose a question, is this death or is it tactical retreat?
It's very interesting.
Because this is a thing we see in the progressive left from essentially the 1960s onwards. Every time it's pushed back as being clearly nonsensical by clever, normal people, it comes back in a different guise. It comes back in a more insidious form.
Yes.
So are you that confident that this time will be different?
There's a very sort of Machiavellian quality to a lot of the activists in the way that they operate, even in terms of, we know that they've infiltrated all major institutions, but even reaching positions of power, they proceed with this kind of process. I'll give you an example. So one of the things I mentioned in the book is the Denton's law firm, and there was a memo by Denton's which was leaked, where they were effectively trying to advise trans activists how best to ensure that parents don't have to consent to gender-affirming care for their children. And a couple of things that they advised was that you should hitch the trans activist gender ideology onto a more popular reform. So, for instance, in Ireland, when they had the referendum for same-sex marriage, they thought they were voting for same-sex marriage, but the activists had hitched onto that the imposition of gender identity ideology. So it's a scam. And what the Denton's document actually says explicitly is that, firstly, that it actually says, if you are too overt about it, if the media understand it, it might not go through. In other words, you have to kind of sneak it through. This kind of incredibly serpentine behavior that they're quite open about. So I think you're right, that there is a sense in which they are now...
they're just following the Gramscian playbook of putting people into positions of power long march through the institutions, which is why I asked the question, is this in fact tactical retreat?
Yes.
Because, yes, in America, the corporations are backing away from DEI because of executive orders. But in this country, there's precious little of that.
Yes.
And what is there to make us have confidence that after President Trump, this will not all come back redoubled?
I wonder about that, and particularly that conflict that you're alluding to between America and Europe in particular. And when J.D. Vance was in the Munich Security Conference, making those very sort of significant points about freedom of speech, and saying to the leaders of Europe, don't be afraid of your own voters, of your own electorate. And everything that he was saying was a no-brainer. Of course it's the case. And people from the left and the right should have accepted what he was saying. But instead, there was I think, didn't the guy at the conference start crying on stage? Yeah, started crying. So they're not taking it well. But I think you're having a kind of breach opening up between almost like the old world and the new, Europe and America, almost like a Henry James novel for the digital age. I think that's sort of happening because you've got these sort of stalwart places like Australia, Canada, Ireland, these places where they don't know that woke is dying. They're going to keep thrashing on and everyone else is moving forward. But what I do think, I completely accept what you're saying, and it could be the case that they are regrouping and rethinking, and how can they bring back something like gender-affirming care in a guise that we haven't seen before? I mean, I think ultimately the thing that will scotch them is the fact that which is not true collapses under scrutiny always. If you're making the case that, and I know I keep talking about the gender issue, but I think it's the key example. If you're making the case that we should reorganize society according to a gendered soul that you claim we have, rather than biological sex, which we know we have, but you can't even define gender identity, and you can't prove that it exists, why are governments around the world revising public health policy and all sorts of policy on the basis of a pseudo-supernatural belief, a religious belief that cannot be quantified or proven? In fact, when Jackie Smith in the House of Lords, who is now the spokesperson for equalities for the government, was asked explicitly, what is the government's working definition of gender identity? She could not answer the question. And in fact, she started blaming the person asking the question, saying, effectively saying, this is a gotcha, saying, we should take this seriously. Why are you trying to catch people out? Well, actually, if you're completely reorganizing society on the basis of this concept, you should be able to define what it is. Not even trans activists can define what it is. When I had a trans barrister on my program, Robin Moira White, I asked, what does gender identity mean? And the response was the essence of male or female, which means nothing. It means a soul. So I don't mind that people have that belief. I believe in freedom of belief. You should have your convictions, and you should be able to practice those convictions. If you believe you have an essence, a male or female essence within you, then fine. But you can't impose that belief on someone else, and you can't tell other people they have to modify their language according to that belief. You can't expect children to be taught that your belief is true in schools, but that is what has been happening. And I think that's going to start falling apart very quickly, partly because of the Cass Review, partly because people are waking up to what is it that I've been supporting. I don't think that many people understood that when it came to the gender ideology thing, I think they thought they were just being kind.
It was an excess of compassion in so many cases.
In a lot.
They did not want to stand up against it because they felt it would be unkind. I think it comes down to that so often.
That, and also intimidation.
Yeah.
I mean, because I've also had a lot of messages over the past 6 years of people saying, I totally agree with you, but I can't say this publicly. So it's that combination of people who are very, very kind and probably a bit thick, and then you've got lots of people who are very, very scared, and that is a dreadful combination. And, ultimately, think about what we supported for a moment. You had the NHS, the National Health Service, diagnosing and still persisting, saying that toddlers should be able to be diagnosed as transgender. This thing that doesn't exist, and actually putting them on drugs, medicalizing them, in other words, medicalizing gender non-conforming kids, which every study tells us are most likely to grow up gay anyway. So in other words, fixing, heterosexualizing gay people on the NHS, gay conversion therapy on the NHS, doing what the mullahs in Tehran do and advocate. In Iran, the government will pay you to have a sex change if they think you're homosexual, because otherwise they'll hang you from a crane. But the NHS were doing it. Now that is an unholy alliance if ever I heard it. And I don't think people they didn't understand the extent of autism within referrals to pediatric gender clinics. They didn't believe any of this was going on. Now we know, there's too much information. People didn't believe that there were men in women's prisons. The guy who, what was his name? He called himself Karen White. He's a rapist and convicted paedophile, then identifies as a woman, is moved to a woman's prison and goes on to sexually assault female inmates. That actually happened. And people don't believe it could happen because I think that's why there was that barrier of just sheer disbelief. But I think too much of this has now been reported. Too much is in the public domain. I don't know how you repackage that. I think if you're a fan of child mutilation and sexual assault in the name of progress, you're going to have to find a better way to trick us into that again, because I think we're done. I think we're done.
So now that this particularly pernicious false metaphysics has been banished or is at least dying off, what's the next spurious belief for the progressive classes to foist upon us?
Could be all manner of things, couldn't it? I think the systemic racism thing is quite alarming. That was something that they've really pushed.
Well, that's been going on for 30 years.
Yes, I know. And I know that this is the weekend of the anniversary of the George Floyd killing. And I saw an advertisement this morning for a memorial event that's taking place with a picture of George Floyd with a halo. Now, at the time, there's lots of sort of graffiti and lots of images of him with angels' wings and this kind of thing. And so there's a real religiosity to this.
Well, it's Chesterton. In the absence of God, men will not believe in nothing, they'll believe in anything.
But why do they take the accoutrements of religion? Why do they take the...
Because they seek for a metaphysical depth that the modern world doesn't provide.
And to make this man a martyr, and I think all loss of human life is terrible, absolutely horrible. I'm not saying anything different about George Floyd. What I'm saying is, the woman who was pregnant and had him hold a loaded gun to her belly might feel differently about that halo, to be honest. So with this, and there were all sorts of religious ideas going on. You know, you saw those videos around the time of the 2020 protests and riots. You saw sort of white people kneeling, proclaiming in religious terms that they were sorry for their sins that they'd inherited.
Our current Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister among them.
They knelt, right? They knelt, exactly.
They took them in the end, tweeted it gaily.
At least they didn't do the intonation. There was an odd one as well.
It's that self-effacement that they feel is necessary to apologise for their very existence as white people.
Well, for something they didn't do. You know, that all those people, even if you were related to a slaver in the distant past, those people are dead. They're gone, and everyone they enslaved is dead and gone. So I find that really, really bizarre. But that sort of public, it's the religiosity that's so fascinating. I mean, the last book I wrote is about that. It's about the sort of how it takes the trappings of religion. And there's so many weird examples. If you want to see a really weird one, this was about 2 years ago in a Christian church in Texas where a group of drag queens are on the altar in full drag, like gargoyle drag, like extreme, like glitter and sequins. And the congregation are being led in a prayer by the minister to say that they support and uphold the LGBT and drag community. And they're chanting like it's a liturgy. It's liturgical. And they're talking, and there's a bunch of drag. It's very funny, but inadvertently so. It's quite frightening. But I think with the systemic racism thing, that's another point. If you're going to make a claim that an institution is systemically racist, well, I want to know, what is that system and who put it in place? Oxford and Cambridge have been accused repeatedly, and Princeton University admitted to being systemically racist, and then, of course, the government said, well, we might take your funding away because that's illegal. They couldn't point to anything. It's not true. Oxford and Cambridge are the least racist places you could go. I mean, the UK is one of the least racist countries that has ever existed. So if you go to... It's just a fact. Like, every reputable study tells us this.
Yeah.
So this sort of self-flagellation and this idea that we are somehow worse than Jim Crow, it's not true. It can't be... I mean, we know it's not true because the studies tell us it's not true. But you still have mostly the elite organisations like Oxford and Cambridge making the claim that they are. So I think that might persist for a bit longer, but I imagine that's going to get stripped away as well, because I think people are uncomfortable with the heightened racialisation of society, or rather re-racialisation of society. I think when the American school here in London segregated children by skin colour for after-school activities, I think people see that and they think we thought we'd left all that behind. So maybe all of that might come back. But the other thing that might happen is you might get this pushback from the right, and there's this very contested term of the woke right, which I have never... See, I've always used woke not as a pejorative, but as a descriptive. For me, I've defined woke as a cultural revolution that seeks equity according to group identity through authoritarian means. I think that sort of summarizes it. Now, if you think, if that is what woke is to you, you can't really dispute the idea that there are authoritarians on all sides of the political spectrum, and there are identity-obsessed authoritarians on all sides of the political spectrum. And we are seeing on the right that rising very much at the moment. So, the idea, who also, by the way, have this strange revisionist idea about history. We're getting a lot of these discussions about maybe Winston Churchill was the true villain of World War II. But I'm not going to debate Andrew Roberts about it because, he might have some facts. And so, that's going on. So, and that's a replication of what we saw on the left from the woke left. So I always think that the culture one of the arguments I make in my book is that we've misunderstood it as a left versus right issue. I think I accept that the philosophical origins of this came from the Frankfurt School and the New Left and the French postmodernists, etc. I accept that there's a leftist Marxian origin, but I don't accept that we can best tackle it by seeing it through that lens, not least because the worst excesses of the woke movement in this country were presided over by the Tories. I mean, that happened throughout their tenure. It was Theresa May, wasn't it, who was trying to rejig this gender, bring in self-ID.
Justine Greening, when she was Secretary of State, followed by Penny Mordaunt, showing that women carrying swords is not any reputable system of government.
Good for her, though. I couldn't do it.
Can I put a counterpoint to you?
Yeah.
That actually the necessary precondition for the ending of wokeness in this country is for us to remember that we are not America, and to stop imposing American cultural and political norms onto the British paradigm, which I think so much of this is systemic racism, the importation of vile anti-Semitism,
yes.
And, for instance, the inability of British people to look at history without thinking that we were the worst slavers the world has ever known. So much of this is down to a complete misunderstanding of our own history and identity.
Yes, not least, our Navy spending 200 years abolishing the slave trade.
Yeah, you point out the West Africa Squadron, and they get quite uncomfortable and then try and claim that it was just so that they could keep their revenues, which is historically untrue. How are we going to fight back against this Americanization of society?
It's such a good point because, do you remember during the 2020 protest that we had in the UK about George Floyd, there was a slogan in America at a lot of the protests of don't shoot.
Stop, don't shoot.
They go up to police and say don't shoot. Well, British people were doing that to British police officers who don't have guns. Like, what did they think they were shooting them with? That importation is so mindless. Critical race theory, of course, comes from the legal scholarship in America of the late 1980s. Intersectionality from a similar source, from people like Kimberly Crenshaw. Yep. You've got queer theory, which is more French in origin, but has really been propelled by the American academics.
Well, I don't know if he's here today, but David Starkey's dictum that all bad ideas are essentially French.
Yeah.
And I think actually there is a point to this. The post-structuralists, the Foucaults, Derridas, not Barthes so much, but all of that was taken on wholesale by American academics in the 60s, and then amplified in a way that I don't think even Foucault could have dreamt of.
Well, it was worse than that, because, Foucault, it doesn't make sense to impose this stuff, because for a start, Foucault's perception of power relations and power operating as a kind of grid throughout society would apply as much to the woke as anyone else, probably more so. He would have had a great time sort of deconstructing what they were up to. So there was, but I noticed this when I was an undergraduate. Everyone, because it was English literature, so everyone was all about Foucault. There was a book called Saint Foucault by a guy called David Halperin. And, but what I realized is a lot of people hadn't read him. They'd either read about him or they'd sort of misappropriated some key principles of Foucault, and it became almost like a religion. But that was like back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it was like you couldn't really dispute it. So that's all been imported and misunderstood. Queer theory has been taken on wholesale. Gender identity, I mean, this is a very good example of what you're talking about. If we're talking about gender identity, the doyenne of queer theory is Judith Butler,
yes,
who doesn't actually believe in gender identity. She believes in this notion that we have this kind of performativity, that we perform acts that mimic gender expectations and norms within society, which creates an illusion of a kind of organizing gendered core. It's the opposite of what her disciples say. So there's all sorts of confusion going on there. But the Americanism is a problem. We simply haven't had the same history of race relations that the Americans have, so it doesn't make sense to import that over. Not that we haven't had racism. Every human society will have racism at some point. But it's incoherent to impose critical race theory in a British setting, and yet it was done. You know, when the BBC told their staff to take the day off and read books like White Fragility and Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. That's the BBC saying you should school yourself in a philosophy that doesn't apply to this country, but do it anyway, because that's the fashionable thing. So the question of how we reinforce ourselves, I don't know. I should say, to be fair, we exported fat studies to America. So fat
yes, they're more in
came
need of
here.
it, though.
They are more in need of it, but except, no, they're not, because of course the principle of fat studies is that obesity, there's no relation between obesity and bad health, that all it is that it's doctors shaming you for your body image.
Of course, personal agency is such a difficult thing for them to grasp.
It's bizarre, isn't it? But that came from Britain. So we can't...
Well, I'm glad we're contributing something to the modern world of ideas. Is not the simple answer that we need to grow confident once again in saying what you are expressing is arrant nonsense with no factual or theoretical basis?
But the people who have been doing that have been monstered as evil, fascist, far-right, psychotic, etc.
Masters of the cause.
Yeah, absolutely, you're right. It's probably about courage, isn't it?
Yeah. And courage in public institutions, I think, is hugely important.
Yes.
The civil service, for instance,
yes.
And the political class. There must be the courage of those of us participating in those places not to be afraid, in fact, of the threat of cancellation. That's what it really comes to.
But you know, they are terrifying. So
I
was speaking to a friend of mine who directed a play in London before it all went absolutely crazy, so just before 2020. And they hired a woke director.
On purpose or by accident?
I think it's just all directors are woke. Yeah. So it's just a matter of degrees. And they hired this woman, and he said that he realized after a couple of weeks of rehearsal that he was treating her like a dangerous dog, because if you said the wrong thing, she would lash out and she would pin you down and say, you can't say that, you've got to change this, etc. So they're really frightening. Oh, yeah. And the problem is, when you get one of them in an institution, they seem to dominate, because they're so extreme, they're so intimidating, they complain about you, make you feel like you're some sort of evil bigot. So of course most people are just going to keep their heads down.
The commissars have always acted in this way.
They have. But you're right. People have got to start saying, actually, no, that's not true. You can't do this.
And we do now have, I think, the structures and institutions to fight back. We have the Free Speech Union. We have this wonderful organisation. Yep. There are now bodies, and I won't call them right-wing, I won't call them conservative. They're just, I suppose, anti-woke.
Yeah.
And anti the imposition of this highly contentious and false ideology. So we do have these battalions at our disposal.
And the thing that's really screwed the leftist activists who want to say that this is a big right-wing evil pushback is that most of the cases that the Free Speech Union are now addressing are from left-wing feminists, because they're the ones who've been targeted for cancellation. And that really messed up their narrative. Because, you know, I know they'd like to say that all these die-hard socialist feminists have become far-right overnight, you know, and they say things like, well, Julie Bindel is now writing for the Daily Mail, or, you know, Hadley Freeman moves over, or whatever it might be. But of course, that's because the left went insane, and the sane leftists had to go somewhere. So they went somewhere else. You know, when you had the Guardian was obviously has been peddling arrant nonsense for a long time. But they've also been intimidating their staff, their female staff. Feminists who believe that you can't change sex because it's true have had to go elsewhere.
Suzanne Moore, perfect
Suzanne
example.
Moore, yeah.
Going to write for the Telegraph.
Yeah.
And so we've got systemic racism, we've got critical theory. What are the other threats on the horizon that you can foresee?
I think there's the free speech issue is absolutely huge. The fact that, I mean, I'll give you an example of this. I didn't realize, because I've always had this maybe a romanticized view that America's First Amendment is a sort of barrier, which is why wokeness was never fully able to take hold over there. But I recently wrote an article for the Washington Post about the problems in the UK, and I cited many of these crazy examples. You know, we've had one just this week, haven't we? The guy who 6 police officers turned up at his house because of a tweet he posted, which was actually a tweet against anti-Semitism, but they misinterpreted the tweet. They turned up and they scoured his bookshelves. And they said they were on body cam footage saying there are very Brexity things on the bookshelves. This is quite a Brexity thing, by the way, right? They wouldn't like this. And so they were doing that, and that's the but this is happening all the time.
To a retired special constable as well.
Quite, exactly. Well, of course, all of this started when, you know, with Harry Miller's case. Harry Miller, former constable, he has the police turn up, say we have to check your thinking because of something someone has said. We have the College of Policing, which is the body that trains coppers in England and Wales in the UK, that arbitrarily introduced non-crime hate incidents in 2015 without a government mandate. And since then, the Free Speech Union estimates there's been over 250,000 of those recorded against individuals. Sometimes for things, there was one for a guy who whistled the Bob the Builder theme tune. There was one for a guy whose dog defecated on someone else's lawn. There was a child at school got a non-crime hate incident for calling a peer a retard. There was another who said that someone smelled like fish. So I haven't checked my records. I must have loads of non-crime hate incidents.
Well, at this point, it's a badge of honour, surely.
Yeah, maybe. But I worry about this stuff because the police are doing that. The government never told them to do it.
Yeah.
Successive Home Secretaries have told them to stop, and they've ignored them. The High Court said it wasn't lawful. They ignored the High Court. And all of this, now I don't want to suggest causality, but I will say, I have noted that the head of the College of Policing at the time that non-crime hate incidents came in had received the year prior Stonewall's top award and was the LGBT envoy. I'm just saying, I don't know, but it looks to me like activist capture. Yeah. And that's going on all across the board. So the free speech issue is massive because this generation of police officers have been trained to believe that it is their job to audit the speech and thoughts of citizens. And it's happening too often. The Lucy Connelly case is a very good example. The government has been pushing for draconian sentencing for memes. That guy who served 8 weeks in prison for 3 memes, none of which were illegal. You know, they've said they're illegal, but I quote the worst one in my book. It's just not very offensive. And
it's also ex post facto judgment of illegality, which is fundamentally without justice. Fundamentally.
Well, not only that, because Starmer had said, I'm expecting substantive sentences from the judges. Now, I think it's a kind of unofficial pressure, because then...
I don't know, if the Prime Minister says it, then surely the police force is going to feel enjoined to act upon that.
Yes, but he didn't put it in a kind of an edict, did he? He just sort of...
No, but
you're right.
A wish expressed by a superior is as good as an order.
You're right. And so many of the judges made clear in the sentencing, we are doing this to set an example. Yeah. In the case of Lucy Connelly, she got 31 months in prison for tweeting about the riots. There was another bloke, Philip Prescott, got 28 months less for actually rioting. So she's getting more for speaking about it than the people who are actually doing it. It's obviously two-tier justice. It's obviously a real problem. That is, to me, the next big battle, because I don't think the free speech battle has been won at all. Whenever I've spoken about the Lucy Connelly case, I get endless pushback from people going crazy about this, saying, yeah, but she admitted it. Yeah, she was urged to plead guilty, as many people were, because she was terrified of being on remand for so long. And, they say, yeah, but she said something nasty. So what?
Well, actually, she didn't. If you read the tweet, and if you have a modicum of ability, as you certainly do with the DPhil in English literature, it is very clear that she is not implying that people should go do things. She's expressing a complete disinterest and unbiased in the case.
Yes.
For all I care. it takes a willful misreading of that tweet, which has now occurred at several levels of the judiciary.
Yeah, she's
So
saying...
this is very obviously maltreatment. And
she's saying if you burn down hotels, I won't care if you do it, right?
Sure, yeah.
It's not the same as... But even if she had said, go out and burn down hotels, if we apply something like the US has, which is the Brandenburg Test, to incitement to violence, that comes nowhere near close to incitement to violence. There's no danger of imminent violence. There's no proof that any violence was caused as a result. In fact, 6 decades of media effects theories tell us that people don't act on cue to the things they read in the media. So it's just not true. So you need to have, with incitement to violence, the intention to incite violence, the likelihood that it will occur, and that it must be imminent. None of those things are satisfied in the Lucy Connelly case. But because we don't have those protections in place in our legal system, it means that people can end up going to prison for nasty tweets or mean tweets. Certainly what we can say is, whatever you think about the tweet, it did cause offence. But I do think, so what? I really do. You know, if I get threats and stuff online all the time and mean tweets every 2 seconds, so I just block them, and that's it.
Yeah.
I don't go to the police about them, because it's insanely authoritarian.
Well, the basis of most humour is causing offence to one group or another at the
It's
exam.
impossible not to.
Yeah, of course. Do you think that, therefore, there has to be a case made for a First Amendment-style piece of legislation here?
The equivalent of the First Amendment, some kind of solid reckoning with this notion of incitement to violence, the scrapping of the hate speech laws, which should not be a thing.
Well, indeed, the Malicious Communications Act 2003 also needs to go, because that's the basis of all of this.
Well, there's that. So there's the Communications Act 2003, there's the Public Order Act 1986. The hate speech laws that we have are encoded into those acts, and the Communications Act specifically says that if you post something that is grossly offensive, you can go to prison for it. But what the hell does that mean? No two governments in the world have been able to agree on what hate means. When the Irish government introduced hate speech laws, or tried to the other year, they said, we define hate as hate. They literally used the same word twice. I'm not joking, that was in the draft legislation. Hatred means hatred.
Good old bit begging the question.
Yeah, well, I mean, what happens when a future government says, oh, you know what, I think criticism of our policies is hatred. And there we have the legislation. This is incredibly blinkered and this complete historical illiteracy that you don't see where this stuff leads. So I think we need to scrap hate speech laws. I haven't heard any politicians stand up and say it. I'd like to see them say we need to scrap hate speech law. We just don't have it, right? I did hear Chris Philp saying that we should get rid of non-crime hate incidents. That's a given. That should go. And what else should we do? Incitement to violence. That needs to be sort of reckoned with. What else? Scrap the College of Policing. Just ditch it. It's not suitable for purpose. It keeps ignoring its instructions from Parliament. So why is it still there? I don't understand. So until we sort all of that stuff out, and until we sort the schools out, so we don't have indoctrination of this stuff in schools, because it's so deeply embedded.
Well, this is the same point we've been dancing around all day, that essentially this is a problem of institutions having taken this ideology to its extreme, beyond the wishes or perhaps beyond the notice of most people who are subject to those institutions.
Yes.
The National Union of Teachers being a perfect example.
Yes, absolutely.
The College of Policing being a perfect example. The many civil service unions being perfect examples of institutions that have decided that this is the ideology of the state.
Well, the biggest teaching union, the NEU, is completely captured, like 100%. So, yeah, it's
well, indeed, was it not the NEU who wrote, or was it the Higher Education Commission who wrote against the Kathleen Stock?
Yes, it was, I think so. Or was that the UCU, University Colleges Union? Either way, all of these things are captured.
They're captured.
And so you need some kind of mechanism to strip that out. When that whistleblower from the civil service came forward and said whistleblowers routinely find ways to ignore instructions from ministers, you need to take a wrecking ball to that and sort of start again. But there's no appetite that I can see in either major party to do any of that.
I think there is an appetite among some of the Conservative Party, but there is also a recognition that it means the entire restructuring of the British state, and they haven't, I think, the intellect or the willpower to do it.
Well, it's hard, isn't it?
Yes.
It's going to take a lot of effort.
Strangely, politics is quite difficult.
It is tricky, isn't it? But don't get into the job if you don't want to deal with that sort of stuff.
And I think, actually, you said, quite rightly, that this got worse under the Tories between 2010 and 2024. And I think part of the reason was absolute abject bloody fear. They hadn't a clue what to do about this. It was being thrown at them from every side, and by people often that they'd appointed. And so the easiest path the easiest path was simply to allow it to happen and think that maybe it wouldn't work itself out as cultural movements do.
And they just didn't understand it. They really didn't understand it. I mean...
Well, it's not the only thing they didn't understand.
No,
yes.
sure. But, you know, I understand why, in a way. You know, when Stonewall, who are the country's leading gay charity, tell you that they're doing something, you don't realise that what they're doing is an anti-gay thing. How would you? It's very strange that Stonewall has been most responsible for the embedding of gender identity ideology in our schools and in our government departments. But gender identity ideology is anti-gay by definition, because it says that biological sex doesn't exist. It says that the foundation stone of gay rights, which is the recognition that a minority of people are going to be attracted to their own sex, that those people are bigots, right? This is why you have men with beards and penises on lesbian dating apps, because of people like Stonewall. That's why that happens. This is why, when Jenny Watson tried to set up a lesbian speed dating event, a man turns up in a dress and demands that he participates. The venue shut her down, and she's called the bigot. This is absolutely insane. I don't know how... So people will fall for that. When you have the head of Stonewall saying that women who aren't attracted to men are sexual racists. Well, what she actually said was, you know, if you're not attracted to women, well, men who identify as women,
yes,
you want to examine your prejudice. Well, you're a gay rights charity, and you're shaming lesbians for being gay. Right, so of course it's confusing if you have just a superficial understanding of what's going on in the culture war. I get that, but it has been explained again and again and again. And yet you still have politicians like, you know, what's his name,
Russ Moyle.
Moyle, yeah, and then like Alicia Kearns and people like that who, Ron, what's the guy, Chris Bryant, like these people who have absolutely no clue about this. But like I say with the Wes Streeting example, you sit down, explain the basics, and they can't reach any other conclusion, actually.
Well, I think in the cases you've mentioned, they're chanting the mantras because that's the only precept of faith they have left.
It's the shibboleths of the faith. Trans women are women. By definition, they're not, because otherwise they wouldn't be trans.
Well, I think it's incredibly funny the way that they talk about passing. If you are something, you needn't pass as it because you are that.
Yes.
You know, if passing is a woman, well, that means that you are by definition not a woman. So
Yes.
why use this rather revealing phraseology of yourself?
Quite. And I remember that TED talk by that activist who said that that trans toddlers would signal their gender identity by their choice of clothing. You know, these people are saying this for real, and what's worse is I think a lot of them believe it, and so therefore, because they're in positions of power, other people believe it. I mean, I mentioned the Lady Hale thing. That is kind of incredible. Some activist doctors tell her something, and she repeats it as though it is true. And you would have thought she's one of the most intelligent women in the country.
You would have thought, unless you'd read any of her judgments. I think actually the point we keep making about institutions is a deeply concerning one, because it's not just government departments, it's not just the civil service, it's charities, it's things like the National Trust, for instance. I hope, by the way, that none of you ever shop at Oxfam ever again, an institution that still keeps the trans pride flag in its window. And that none of you will renew your subscriptions to National Trust and go and see, in fact, Restore Trust sitting at the back there with the wonderful Cornelia van der Pol, and give them your money instead. They're much more deserving.
Yes. That's an interesting point about the National Trust. They became sort of obsessed with the idea that their staff would have to celebrate LGBTQ plus history. All these placards started appearing in the various properties.
Felbrick Hall in Norfolk.
Oh, really?
Wyndham Kitten Kramer's house, because he is supposed to have been homosexual, therefore they all had to wear rainbow lanyards to affirm this.
Oh, right. Okay.
A man who would have been horrified by the very idea.
He would have been horrified. And also the connection with slavery. I mean, it was actually David Starkey who pointed out that by the study that the NT did themselves, it was only something like between 5 and 10% of the properties that could be connected to the slave trade. So why this incredible sort of overweening attempt to sort of politicise what is basically just a bunch of sort of older middle class people who want a scone of a day. You know, it's not. They don't want to be hectored about systemic racism and queer theory. You know, they want afternoon tea.
Well, indeed. But the thing is that the National Trust is run by people who want to proselytise them, just as so many institutions in our country.
It's so boring. The museums, like when you go to the famous one was the Hogarth exhibition, where there was a self-portrait, and the person had written next to it that the wood of the chair that he was sitting on might have been connected to his slavery somehow It was incredibly tenuous. And then there was that Transport for London leaflet about the racist gardens around the Myatt's Park.
Well, but we know now that the countryside is racist, so how could gardens not be?
Yeah.
I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, that this most enjoyable session with Andrew is drawing to a close. I'd like to thank you all for coming to this exceptionally good festival, for coming to this wonderful talk by Andrew, and I would like to enjoin you once again to go and buy many books from all of the authors here, not least my boss, John O'Sullivan, over from Budapest.
And I'll be signing this book just over here in the corner, like the whore that I am.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you all so very much.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.